morning, my holy sisters and brothers. Wasn't that beautiful? That's a nigun by Rabbi Shlomo Katz. I was just reading the story about it. It's called Anapoli, or Anapoli. So that, of course, is, so if you've heard of Reb Zusha, the famous Rebbe, Reb Zusha, he's Reb Zusha of Anapoli, or Anapoli, or Anapol. And in the cemetery there in Anapoli, that's where Reb Zusha is buried, and also the Maggid of Mezrich. So two, great Rebbes in the early history of Hasidism. And Rabbi Katz, Shlomo, would he leads trips to the Ukraine to go around to visit the keverim, the various tombs of great Rebbes. He leads people around, and they sing and talk and share Torah on the bus as they go from one place to another. I mean, I know a little bit about that scene from having been to Uman twice, and then we get in the cars and drive, and we go to Medjugorje, and we go to Breslov, and etc. And so you drive hours between these places where these holy Rebbes live. So Rabbi Shlomo, Rabbi Katz, is a Kohen. So since the main thing you do on these trips in the Ukraine is you visit cemeteries to visit the graves of these great tzaddikim, these great righteous Rebbes, it's a little bit rough on somebody who's a religious Jew and a Kohen, right, a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, because Kohens don't go into a cemetery, don't walk over a grave, except if it's a very close relative. So he would be leading these trips, leading people in song, sharing Torah on the bus rides, and then they would get to wherever they're going in the tomb, and then they all go in without him, and Reb Shlomo's out there on the bus, or in the cold, and in the rain. I mean, Ukraine, it's often very cold. So he says, he got over it. It's okay. He understands. I mean, he has his own obligations that he has to fulfill, and so he can't go into the cemetery. Okay. But it was particularly difficult for him because he's very devoted to Reb Zusha, the Halakha Reb Zusha. And so when everybody went inside and he could hear them singing and dancing there by the final resting place of Reb Zusha, and here Shlomo Katz was outside in the rain with his guitar on his back, he really felt himself get down and sad. And he actually asked the Almighty to comfort him. And the melody came, that nigun. And it just came to him. He says he didn't write it, he brought it down. Similar like Shlomo Carlebach would say, he didn't write the melodies, he just brought them down from Shemayim, from heaven. And so he just started singing it. And gradually, he wasn't even really aware, the people that were inside singing and dancing by Reb Zusha's tomb came out and joined Rabbi Katz out there and joined in the song. And it just went around and around, and it kept going and getting bigger. And for 45 minutes, they were singing that nigun. So that's the story of that nigun. And Reb Shlomo says that many times he has tried to, pick a verse from the prayers or from the Torah, from the Psalms, to sort of be the words of that song. And he says, it's never really fit. It's just a nigun. It's just a melody. It doesn't need to be attached to a particular verse. So there you go, Anapoli by Rabbi Shlomo Katz. All right, who is with us as we get it going on a Thursday night? Good Shabbos, my friends. It's already a good Erev Shabbos. We're so excited. Tomorrow will be in Shabbos itself, tomorrow night. Okay, we've got Yehudit saying Erev Tov, Nina Salin, all from South Carolina. Paul in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, Gail in Virginia, Renee in Indy, Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Bill in Berkeley, Ann in Merced, Brandon in Knoxville, Daisy RG, Shalom from Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Jesse Paul from Ponte Vedra Beach in Florida, Rochelle is in Modesto, James in Indy, John in Sedona, Fatima in Venezuela. Bienvenida, Fatima. Michael in Scranton. Bill says, oh, that's beautiful. What a wonderful answer to a prayer. And the name of the song is Anapoli, Anapoli. It's a little city in Ukraine. Steve Ribick in Tallahassee. Paula says, hello, dear ones. And John says, don't forget to light up the darkness. Thank you, John. It's great. We really, it's like, this is our class, right? I mean, there's names that are here every day, and you know me, and I can easily forget to light the candle in my exuberance. So thank you for the reminder. And Sue says, you never know when you will be given a gift. Exactly. Sue in the house from Chicago. Paula says, hello, dear ones. Over there on the YouTube side, Neil with us from Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Good to be with you. Where are we holding? This is Daf Kuf Gimel, page 103, here in Tractate Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud, the Laws of Passover. We're in chapter 10. We're still discussing the first Mishna of chapter 10, and now, so long we've been talking about the sacrifices and other ancient practices of Passover, and now we're moving into practices that are both ancient and modern, and we're really going to be talking about the Seder. We already talked about the 4 cups of wine. Then we got into this idea of whether we fast or not on the afternoon before Passover begins that night. My friends, it is not far away. Remember that it is an obligation of a Jew to be studying the laws of Passover in the 30 days before any festival. We start studying the laws and customs of that festival. So we're in that period for Passover. We're also starting to eat up the chametz in our homes, the leavened bread and leavened products, and not replace them so that when we come to that spring cleaning right before Passover, it'll be a little bit easier. We don't have so much leaven in our houses. That's the period that we're in now. So we were talking about this idea that you don't eat on the afternoon, and that led to a discussion of the interruption and whether it's and if a meal is interrupted, do we have to say blessings, conclude that meal and then say blessings again when we come back after the interruption. That's where we've been. And then yesterday we got to this question of how we handle when a festival begins on Saturday night, which I believe is Passover this year. It begins on Saturday night. So the very issues we're talking about here, we will be discussing. How do we handle that we're coming out of Shabbos? And so we would need to make Havdalah to separate between the holiness of Shabbos and the mundane days of the week. That's what we normally do, but now we're going to be separating between sacred and sacred, the holiness of Shabbos and the holiness of Passover. And our sages, now we really see, it's not like they had this big central authority that told everybody what to do. There were just a lot of different opinions about how to handle this situation. Yesterday we shared where the halacha finally came out with that acronym Yakanaz, right? Yayin, wine, Kiddush, Yaknahaz, right? Ner, the candle, Havdalah, and then Zaman, meaning you make the Shechechianu blessing over the new holiday. So that's the way that we handle it. But there's all these other opinions about how other people did it. So I'm not going to go into everyone has a little different nuance in the order of these blessings and how they handle it. I'll just mention that they're starting at the bottom of page 102 and into the top of page 103. We got opinions on how exactly to handle that transition from Shabbos to a festival. Rav had an opinion, Shmuel had an opinion, Rabbah had a different opinion, Levi had a different opinion, Mar, the son of Rabbana, Marta said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua, and the father of Shmuel, Abba ben Abba, sent a letter to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi saying, teach us, our rabbi, how should one recite the order of Havdalah when a festival occurs after Shabbos? And Rebbe sent him the following response. This is what Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, said, who said it in the name of his father, who said it in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, that the proper order of the blessings is Nun, Hey, Yud, Kuf, which would be the candle, the Ner, Havdalah, separating between one and another, the Yud for the Yayin, and then the Kuf for the Kiddush. So with that beautiful provenance of all these different super prominent sages who held that way, was the halacha, the law finally established according to that? No, it was not. It was established the way that Rava said it. And Rava says it's, again, Yaknaz, when we go from Shabbos to a festival, right? We do the wine and then the Kiddush, meaning we make a blessing on the wine, and then we make a blessing, blessing God for giving us the sanctity of this new holiday. Right, so while we're coming out of Shabbos, but the first thing we do is bless a cup of wine and then make Kiddush on Passover, or at least on a festival. I mean, Passover has its own special things, of course. So the wine and then the Kiddush, then the candle, which is the Havdalah candle, which a multi-wick candle, and then the blessing of Havdalah. So there'd be a blessing over the flame of the candle, and then the blessing of the Havdalah, separating between one period of time and another. And then finally, the Ziman, the Zion, which is, we recite the Shechachianu, thanking and blessing God for enabling us to still be alive on this day and to reach this joyous occasion, right? We should never take a day for granted. The fact that we reached a festive event and can enjoy it, even if we're alone, but how much more if we can enjoy it with some loved ones, we should just thank God that we're alive and we're there to do that. That's the Shechechianu. All right, so this is where we pick it up, near the top of page 103. Rabbi Hanina said that the following parable serves to explain the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, which we don't follow. This is comparable to a king who is exiting a city and a governor is entering. Now, what's nice about this is at least we're finally getting a little bit of a reason, right? Before we listed all these different opinions about, what is the order of how we exit Shabbos and enter a festival in terms of the blessings that we have to make. But it was just that what this guy does like that, and that guy does like this, and this guy does like that, and that guy does like this. And we're not getting a reason. So now we're getting a reasoning. Right, so the parable explains the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. And this is comparable to a king who is exiting a city and a governor is entering. So pause. We're saying we're going from Shabbos to a festival. Shabbos, every week. Festival, once a year. You might think that since we're going from something that happens every week to something that happens once a year, it would be like we're saying goodbye to a governor and saying hello to a king. Like you might think it's more rare and more eminent. No, in Judaism, we actually prioritize things that happen more often. So Shabbos going out is the king departing our town, and this festival coming in is like this governor arriving. So etiquette dictates that the inhabitants of the city first escort the king out of the city to take leave of him in a dignified fashion, and afterward they go out to greet the governor. And similarly, one should first recite Havdalah to take leave of Shabbos, and only then recite Kiddush over the festival whose sanctity is lesser than that of Shabbos. Right? Shabbos has the most sanctity, even though it happens every week. Isn't that amazing? The biggest holiday of the year happens every week. Now, but we don't do it that way. And one reason that comes to mind immediately of why we don't do it that way, and that in fact, what do? We say Kiddush over the incoming holiday before we say Havdalah over the outgoing Shabbos. So it makes us think, like, if you actually had a king departing your village and a governor arriving, what would surely happen is that the governor would make it his business to get in town before the king left so that the king and the governor could be together, right? And so perhaps that's why we have this nice overlap and why we might say Kiddush for the incoming before Havdalah on the outgoing. That's my own speculation. The Gemara asks, what halachic conclusion was reached about this matter? What is the proper order of the blessings? And the Amoraim accept Rav's opinion that one should recite Kiddush before Havdalah. However, they disagree about the blessing of time, which is generally relevant in such cases, meaning a festival is coming in, so we're going to recite Shechachianu. and which Rav did not address. And so what was left was only the disagreement about where to put Shechechianu. And Abaye said you would do wine and then Kiddush and then Shechechianu and then light the candle, make a blessing and say Havdalah. But Rava said, no, you make a blessing over wine, then you make Kiddush over the incoming festival, then you light the candle and make a blessing over it, then you say Havdalah, and then you recite Shechechianu. And the Gemara concludes the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Rava. With regard to this issue of Havdalah, the Gemara relates that Rav Huna bar Yehuda happened to come to the house of Rava. So now this is fun. So now we've been talking about like that more specialized situation of how we're going to deal with Shabbos going into a festival. But just on the normal question of every Shabbos, when we make Havdalah, right, we make a blessing on as we leave Shabbos after Shabbos is over, and normally, right, we would sing Hine El Yeshua, see, etc. Behold the salvation. Behold, God is my salvation. And we light a candle, then we sing that. We have a cup of wine in front of us. We have the spice handy. Then we make a blessing over the wine, but we don't drink it. We make a blessing over the spice, and then we smell it. We make a blessing over the fire, and then we make sure to use it. We normally hold up our fingers so that a little bit of light, if there's enough light so that you can tell the difference between your fingernail and your finger by the light of the candle, then that light has worked, right? The light worked. You did work with that light, and now it's like you're back into the week. You're out of Shabbos. And then you make the Lahavdil blessings, blessing God who separates between sacred and profane, between Israel and the nations, between the days of work and the days of rest, etc. And then the final blessing, God who separates between sacred and mundane. So that's Havdalah. That's the way it came out. That's what we follow now. But what we're going to do in our discussion today is see how the various sages did Havdalah, and they had lots of different practices, and we're kind of going to get a little bit of an insight into people's homes and how they lived and how they differed 2,000 years ago. So Rav Huna bar Yehuda happened to come to the house of Rava, right? So Rava, we know, super prominent. The halacha usually follows Rava, particularly when he and Abaye disagree. The halacha, the law, is with Rava. So Rava, after Shabbat, they brought before them, right? So Rav Huna is at Rava's house. And after Shabbat, they brought before them a light and spices. Presumably the wine is already on the table. Rava recited the blessing over the spices first, and then the blessing over the light, which is what we do, although first we say a blessing over the wine. Rav Huna bar Yehuda said to him, but both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, so two traditions, the followers of Hillel and the followers of Shammai, who had a lot of different disagreements over things, and generally speaking, we follow Hillel. We follow Beis Hillel in most things. So here Rav Huna says, but both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, who dispute the order of the blessings at Havdalah, agree that the blessing over light is first, and only then the blessing over the spices. And what is this? What is the source for the dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? As we learned in a Mishna, Beis Shammai say that with regard to one who is required to say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, and Havdalah, so they had a late meal on Shabbos, and they were still sitting at the table when it became dark and it was nightfall and Shabbos was over. So they still need to say the grace after the meal over the meal that they just ate, and they need to say Havdalah. And as we've seen already, we've discussed that they should have two separate cups of wine for those two ideas because they're separate. One is just a grace over the meal, and another is welcoming the new week and saying goodbye to Shabbos. Very different kinds of ideas. Okay, so both, hold on a second. And as we learn in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai say that with regard to one who is required to say the grace after meals and Havdalah, and he has only one cup of wine, the proper order of the blessings is the blessing over the candle, the blessing of the grace after meals, followed by the blessing over the spices, and finally, Havdalah. And Beis Hillel say the blessing over the candle comes first, and then the blessing over the spices, and afterward the blessing of the grace after meals, and last is Havdalah. So both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that the blessing over the candle is recited before Havdalah. That we still have. So Rava answered after him and said, this Mishnah is the statement of Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Yehuda says, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel did not disagree over the grace after meals, as everyone agrees that it is recited first. Nor did they disagree over Havdalah, as it is recited last. With regard to what did they disagree? They disagreed over the blessings recited in the middle of Havdalah, i.e. the blessings over light and over the spices. Beis Shammai say light first and spices thereafter, and Beis Hillel say spices first and light thereafter. And Rabbi Yochanan said the people were accustomed to conduct themselves in accordance with the opinion of Beis Hillel, according to the interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda. Rava acted as dictated by this custom, right? So again, no real central authority, right? The sages as a body act as the authority, and their disputes are recorded here, first in the Mishnah and then in the Gemara. And then over time, the halacha, the actual law, became set. But when the sages themselves were active, you see, there's already competing and differing traditions, and definitely customs will vary by locality. They're still going to say all the blessings. All they're really differing on is the order of the blessings. The Gemara relates another incident with regard to establishing meals and reciting blessings. Rav Yaakov bar Abba happened to come to Rava's house for the Shabbos meal. So it's Rava's house again, different guest, Rav Yaakov bar Abba. He saw that Rava recited the blessing who creates the fruit of the vine over the first cup of wine that he drank at the meal, and then he recited the same blessing upon the cup of wine he used for the blessing of grace after meals and drank it. So in other words, they're having wine with dinner. So before they take the first sip of wine at dinner, Rava made a bracha, he made a blessing over wine, right, which ends in Borei Pri Agafen. So blessed are you, Lord our God, who rule the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. The other guests say amen, and then they drink wine. So that's the simple bracha over wine. And then at the end of the meal, presumably they had a minyan there, so they're going to say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, over a cup of wine. And at the conclusion of the grace after the meals, he says the same blessing, but a second time over wine. So the question is, well, they're at the same table. It's the same meal. They already said a blessing over wine at the beginning of the meal. Why, at the end of the meal, is he going to say a blessing over wine again? Does he think that we need to say blessings in the same meal over the same food more than once? That's the question. So the guest, Rav Yaakov bar Abba, said to him, why do you have to say all this? In other words, why is it necessary to recite a second blessing? The master has recited a blessing for us once already at the beginning of the meal, and thereby exempted us from a blessing on all the wine drunk during the meal. Rava said to him, when we were in the house of the exilarch, this was our practice. It was the custom among the sages to recite two blessings. So the reason that he's giving is custom. That's the way he learned it from his teachers, from his elders, and so he acquired the same habit. Now, as we're going to see, there's a good reason. Can you guess what it is? I'm pausing. I wish I had a classroom with live people so we could have actual discussions. But the reason is, when you are saying the grace after meals, what you've done is signal to yourself, to your friends at the table, and to God that you're done. You're done with the meal. You don't contemplate eating more of the meal. So then you say the grace over the grace after the meal, but you've said it over a cup of wine. So with the intention that you're going to drink this wine, but this wine is not part of the meal. This wine just comes at the end of the grace after meals. Since you already finished eating and said grace, now you're going to make another blessing over this wine. And, where am I? He said to him, it works, so presumably Rav Yaakov bar Abba is now answering. He said to him, it works out well to act this way in the house of the exilarch, right? The exilarch is the head of the Jewish community in Bavel, which is Persia. So very, very, very prominent person, the head of the whole Jewish community. And that was a big, big, well-established Jewish community. An aristocrat. So it works out well to act this way in the house of the exilarch, as there is uncertainty as to whether he will bring us another cup of wine to drink or whether he will not bring us another cup. Since we are dependent upon the host and cannot anticipate in advance whether we will drink more wine, each cup requires its own blessing, right? So now what Rav Yaakov is saying, in the house of the exilarch, since you don't know how much wine is coming, every time, they pour, you might think, the wine is done. So you don't have in mind that your blessing includes any further wine. And then if wine does happen to come out, it's like a new thing. And then you might say the blessing anew for this, new course of wine, as it were. Here, however, the cup is resting before us and our attention is on it, i.e., we intend to drink this wine after the grace after meals. What need is there to recite another blessing? And Rava answered, I acted in accordance with the opinion of the students of Rav. As Rav Baruna and Rav Hananel, the students of Rav, were sitting together at a meal, and Rav Yeva the elder stood over them to serve them. And they said to him, give us a cup of wine, and we will recite the blessings of the grace after meals. Ultimately, they changed their mind and said to him, give us a cup of wine and we will drink it. He said to them that Rav said as follows, since you have said, give us a cup and we will recite the blessings of grace after meals, it is prohibited for you to drink anymore, right? When you say, give us the cup of blessing, meaning the cup that is going to be blessed and drunk after the grace after meals, when you call for that cup, you have signaled that the meal is over. So you can't change your mind, go back to drinking and eating, and then come back to the grace after meals. You've ended your meal. If you want to eat more now, say the grace after meals, and then make a new blessing, and then go back to eating and drinking. What is the reason for this? The reason is that you have diverted your attention from drinking. Therefore, if you want to drink anymore, you must recite the blessing over wine again. The Gemara relates that Amemar, Mar Zutra, and Rav Ashi, usually when a sage has the prefix Mar, he is one of the exilarchs. I mean, there's one in every generation, but Mar Zutra was the exilarch in Bavel. So Amemar, Mar Zutra, and Rav Ashi were sitting at a meal. And Rav Acha, the son of Rava, stood over them to serve them. Amemar recited a blessing over each and every cup of wine he drank. And Mar Zutra recited a blessing over the first cup he drank during the meal and over the last cup he drank upon concluding the grace after meals. Rav Ashi recited a blessing over the first cup and did not recite any further blessings over the subsequent cups that he drank. So it's three different behaviors. One guy blessed the first wine that he drank and he never made another blessing. Another guy blessed the first cup that he drank and then made a blessing again after the meal was over, after they recited the grace after the meals, and then for that final cup of wine. And one guy made a blessing on every cup of wine he drank during the meal. Rav Acha bar Rava said to them, in accordance with whose opinion should we act in this matter? We have witnessed three different courses of action. Amemar said, I repeatedly changed my mind. In other words, he wasn't making a blessing over each cup of wine because a new cup of wine was brought to him. The reason he made a blessing is because each time he finished a cup of wine, he said, okay, I'm done. No more. I can't have any more. And then they brought him some more wine, and another hour went by, and the Torah conversation was pleasing, and he didn't feel like he had drunk too much. He said, you know what, I'm going to have another glass of wine. Since in his mind he had already finished drinking, and now was starting anew, he said a blessing each time. Mar Zutra said, I acted in accordance with the students of Rav. They maintain that one who prepares to recite grace after meals has completely diverted his attention from drinking, and therefore the blessing on wine that one recites during the meal does not include the wine that he drinks after the grace after meals. And that, in fact, is the way we do it. If you look, in the bencher, the grace after meals, and when the minyan is present, we say it over a cup of wine. At the end of the grace after meals, there's a bracha, Berei Pri Hagafen, over wine. And Rav Ashi said, the halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of the students of Rav. This can be proven from a ruling of Rav himself, as with regard to a festival that occurs after Shabbos, Rav said that the order of blessings is Yud Kuf Nun Hey, meaning wine, Kiddush, candle, and Havdalah. This shows that although one recites Kiddush between the blessing over wine and Havdalah, it is unnecessary to recite the blessing over wine again before Havdalah. The same should hold true in our case. Just as Kiddush is not considered an interruption between the blessing over wine and its consumption, and it's not, right? Because on Friday nights, that's what we do at the table. We first say the blessing over the wine, right? And then we say the Kiddush and continue it. And then we drink it, right? So where am I? But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. And that is not so. There, when one is preparing himself to recite the grace after meals, he has already uprooted his mind from drinking. Here, with regard to Kiddush and Havdalah, he has not uprooted his mind from drinking, right? Because when we're making a blessing over wine, knowing that we're then going to say Kiddush and then we're going to drink it, okay, that's what we have in mind to do. When we're drinking wine at a meal and then we decide the meal is over, the meal is over. We're no longer drinking wine. That we are going to have a little wine at the end of the grace after meals is a separate issue. It's a different reasoning for why we're drinking that wine. After discussing the opinion, and I'm almost done, so if you have questions, get them in the comments now. After discussing the opinion of the students of Rav, the Gemara returns to the story of Rav Yaakov bar Abba's visit to Rabbah. When the time came to recite Havdalah, Rabbah's attendant got up and lit a torch from a candle. And Rav Yaakov bar Abba said to him, "Why do you need all this? The candle was present, and you could have recited the blessing over the light of the candle itself." Rava said to him, "The attendant did this on his own accord without consulting me." Rav Yaakov bar Abba said to him, "If he had not heard it from the master," meaning you, "he would not have done it on his own. He must have been following your opinion on this matter." And Rava said to him, "Well, does the master," they call each other the master, "does the master not maintain that using a torch for Havdalah is the optimal manner in which to fulfill the mitzvah? It is for this reason that the attendant lit a torch for Havdalah. Yeah, we could have done it over a candle, but it is better to do it over a torch, over a more significant flame." And of course, today, when we make Havdalah, it has to be a multi-wick candle. So you've seen the beautiful Havdalah candles that have all the, swirling colored candles together and many wicks. But at a minimum, if you don't have a Havdalah candle, ideally, if you have nothing else, but you have two candles, that will work. You put two candles together so the wicks are touching, and now you've made essentially a multi-wick candle reminiscent of a torch, which is the optimal way to recite Havdalah. Rava began his recitation of Havdalah, and he said, and here, this is the Havdalah prayer, right? Not the blessings which open the Havdalah ceremony, but the Havdalah prayer itself. And this will sound familiar, right? He said, "Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lehoshek, ben Yisrael le'amim, ben yom hashvi l'sheshes hemei ha'ma'aseh." Right? Very familiar words if you make Havdalah. Who distinguishes, blessing God, who distinguishes between sacred and profane, between light and darkness, between Israel and the nations, between the seventh day and the 6 days of work. So Rava's formula of how to say Havdalah, how to set up the Havdalah blessing, because at the end of explaining how God distinguishes between one thing and another, at the end, then you say Baruch atah Hashem, Hamavdil ben Kodesh lechol, who separates between holiness and the mundane. So Rav Yaakov bar Abba said to him, "Why do you need all this?" right? He's not being sarcastic. Why do you need all that? He's really asking, so why do you do all of these? Because I've heard that you could do it in a simpler way. Is there what is your reasoning for making it a little bit more complex than what I, Rav Yaakov, am used to? And he buttresses his question with a source. He says, didn't Rav Yehuda say that Rav said with regard to the statement who distinguishes between sacred and profane, that this alone is the Havdalah of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? Why is this plain statement not enough for you? Why, when you make Havdalah, you say that God separates between the days of holiness and the normal days, between Israel and the nations, between light and darkness, all these distinctions that God draws. Why do you add that to the ceremony? Why don't you just say, blessed is God who distinguishes between sacred and profane? Rava answered him, I maintain, in accordance with this statement, that Rabbi Elazar said, that Rabbi Oshaya said, one who decreases the number of distinctions in the text of Havdalah should not decrease them to less than 3, and one who increases the number of distinctions should not increase them to more than 7. So, it's become a formula, and we all say the same thing when we make Havdalah, but we see here how it evolved, and it was not so strict. Right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, it's enough to say, blessed is God who distinguishes between sacred and mundane, or profane, same thing. But there was another tradition that said, okay, but if it's nice if you show, essentially, instead of tell, you show how God distinguishes between certain things. But when you're listing these distinctions, if you list them, you should have no less than 3 and no more than 7. So clearly there were different streams and traditions among the sages in different localities, the way they inherited it from their fathers and teachers, etc. And so that's where it comes out. That's where we're going to leave off the conversation, and we're going to continue how that Havdalah formula evolved at the top of tomorrow's page 104. Tomorrow at the regular time. Fridays, we always go noon Pacific as we're getting ready for Shabbos. Okay, let us check comments and questions here on Pesachim 103. Bill, this insight into the consensus decision-making process of the sages is one of the reasons I started tuning into this show nightly. It's such a good example of how we discern the will of God, not in a top-down way of centralized authority, but collectively our efforts facilitated by the wise. Just so, Bill. And what I love also is how the wise don't just say, well, and according to my wisdom, this is the way that it should be. The wise will also say, and here's what other wise people do, and here's what other wise people do, and here's what the people do. And we know that there is wisdom in the collective, right? Have you ever known a town's populace to be wrong about somebody's character? That's an old saying from some books that I enjoy, the Aubrey Maturin novels, if anyone's familiar with those. But at any rate, yes, it's this collective process of not only looking into scripture for sources, not only appealing to logic for the reasons for things, but also looking at tradition and also just seeing the customs that have developed among the people. Steve responding to Bill. I picked up something different from Rav Steinsaltz's commentary on the Talmud. There is pursuit of logic to establish a truth, even if the topic has little or no relevance to present-day issues. I suspect the difference in some rulings were only overcome with a very rigorous process rather than a process that seeks consensus. Just my thoughts. Well, that's interesting. Were they seeking consensus? No, not consensus for the sake of consensus, right? There were times when they said, now wait a minute, we can't have half the population doing it one way and half doing it the other way. We need to find a consensus that's going to work. And in those cases, they said, we're looking for that. But there were other times when no, they were just saying, I see it this way, this is the truth and I'm sure of it. And other people said, this is the truth and I'm sure of it. And it was a passionate disagreement, and they weren't looking for a compromise solution, right? And so in that very famous story, the oven of Achnai, when it was Rabbi Eliezer against all the sages, they were very passionate about their reasons. They could have found some compromise ground, but they wouldn't do it. Rabbi Eliezer was sure that he was right, and he had the support of a voice from heaven in his halakhic ruling. But the rest of the sages in that case had voted on the matter, and their point was, look, we may be wrong, but we can't have a minority opinion who's just gonna, push aside what we have come to simply because you're sure that you're right. And now the people are going to be taught something that we would consider a sin, right? So we can have variety when it comes to customs, but they're going to be much more hardcore when there's a risk that people are going to become to transgressing by relying on their words. So Bill and Steve, I mean, you're both right. And it really is situation dependent. There's not an underlying philosophy of either consensus building or truth seeking that's going to apply to every situation. Every situation has its own needs depending on what behaviors is going to result from that meeting, as it were. And that's why with many very, very passionate and very brilliant scholars going like this, it took hundreds or thousands of years for the law to finally settle in place. And some things are still being worked out, and we still have variety of customs. It's so funny. We were just talking about this the other day that, like if you're a Jew who becomes more observant, and you're kind of sort of going up that ladder of observance. So at the beginning, you look at the kind of the Orthodox community and the guys who wear black suits and white shirts and black hats on Shabbos, and you're like, well, a lot of variety in the world that I'm in, but those guys do everything the same, right? They're all basically on the same page. And then when you finally get into the Orthodox world, you see oh no, there's tremendous diversity in the way they do things. Not on basic matters of halacha, of law, but nevertheless, what's emphasized, how they teach, how they learn, just small different nuances in the prayer service, which, after you really get used to it, when you hear one of these differences, you're like, whoa, that was not what I thought was going to happen. That's just the Jewish world as it is. Okay, Alan Resnick. 3 men, 3 different ways of saying his blessings, so no one is wrong. I cannot imagine if there were podcasts or TV at the time. I'm a Jewish man trying to reconnect, so I listen every night and take what I can from each teaching. Beautiful, Yasher Koach, Alan. We're all there in the same place, right? And there's no way to master this material. Even somebody who's teaching Daf Yomi for the 5th cycle in a row would not say that he has mastered the material. There's so much to be learned every time that we go through it, so we're all in that same boat. Sharon, it would not be possible to extinguish the Havdalah candle, even if lit from an existing flame. What are we talking about? This comment just came in by itself to me. It would not be possible to extinguish the Havdalah candle. I mean, I assume you're talking about if you're having Havdalah after Shabbos when we're going into Passover, would we blow out the Havdalah candle? And I don't know that offhand, but it seems like, no, you can't extinguish the Havdalah candle, right? We don't extinguish a flame. We will kindle a flame, but really from an existing candle in order to cook on a festival. That's the difference between a festival and Shabbos. We can cook on the festival for the needs of the festival, as we've talked about many times. Exactly. So Nina's adding the note. So exactly. So when we go into a holiday from Shabbos and we're going to make Havdalah, we can't put out that candle. So that's something we have to think in advance. What are we going to do with that Havdalah candle? So Sharon says in contemporary Siddurim, right? So in contemporary Jewish prayer books and Haggadahs for Passover, the blessing of Hamavdil is a part of the Kiddush on holidays. Is this the later evolution of this ruling? I'm not sure. But after your comment, it was you, right, Sharon, last night, I realized that I wasn't sure whether we say a blessing over each and every one of the 4 cups of wine on Passover. Like I didn't know offhand, because, when you're at the Seder, just kind of go along with the Seder. And I've even studied the Haggadah. I studied it quite a bit, in fact, when we made When Do We Eat? There I was looking for more kind of inner meanings of things. But yesterday I just took a look, and we say a blessing over wine 4 times. Over each of the 4 cups of wine, it's a new wine blessing, right? Now that would seem to contradict what we've been talking about tonight. And I didn't look ahead at tomorrow's page or the day after. I wonder if we're going to get there, because Passover has different needs, right? It's not just a dinner that we have together, right? It's a very elaborate, orchestrated dinner. And these 4 cups of wine, the first one we're going to say a blessing over wine, which is the Kiddush, right, to introduce the festival of Passover that night at the Seder. And the second cup of wine, because we haven't started eating yet, right? So it was like that first one was for Kiddush, but we did not have in mind that we're blessing all the cups of wine which follow. So then when we actually get to wine a little later, the second cup of wine, which now that is going to be the wine that we have with dinner, we say a blessing over that. Then we finish dinner and we make Birkat Hamazon, the grace after the meals, and there's a cup of wine that comes at the end of that, even if we don't have the minyan. And then there's the 4th cup of wine, which accompanies Hallel, which we say after the Birkat Hamazon, and that also gets its own blessing, again, because the cups of wine are serving different purposes within the meal. It's not that you said a blessing over all the wine you're going to drink at dinner. That's the blessing of the second cup. But the first is for Kiddush, the third is for Birkat Hamazon, and the 4th is for Hallel. All right, that's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 104 at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a